Paul Markham here, and this is my wife's 1962 Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. I know I've done lots and lots of other videos of me driving around talking in the DKW and in the Tatra, but I've never actually done a video talking about the Karmann Ghia. This is a very beautiful car, and in terms of appearance, it's a wonderful, good-looking vehicle that it's just a classic, iconic vehicle from the period. Volkswagens are really interesting. I think. I don't know. It's kind of a strange thing to say about what was a bare minimum real budget economy vehicle, but they were really surprisingly innovative for their time. So let's go for a drive, and I'll tell you a little bit about both the Volkswagen Beetle and its origins, and the Karmann Ghia. Ferdinand Porsche designed the Volkswagen Beetle in 1935. He'd planned for it to be really low maintenance, ultra reliable car that really anybody could own. And it absolutely does that in spades. Like, I haven't driven this car for a couple of months now, and in both the Tatra and the DKW, especially the DKW, if the car doesn't get driven for a couple of weeks, it becomes very hard to start and needs a lot of effort to, coax it back into life. The Volkswagen, none of that applies. You hop in the car after 3 months of no driving, and it just starts up first pop, and it just runs. And I know a lot of people really hate Volkswagens. They think that they're a terrible car, and you can make that argument certainly, because there are elements of this car that's very simplistic and very basic. But that was the point. The car was designed for that. It was designed to be simple, low maintenance. It would drive you around and get you where you needed to go for the minimum of fuss. And if you put yourself into the mind or the experience of people who'd driven cars in the 1930s and 40s, the Volkswagen Beetle would have been a revelation, because it just did everything that you needed a car to do. The engine was very simple. It's very low horsepower. It's not going to win any races in its standard format, but then that wasn't the plan. That engine was designed to just run forever, and that's why the Volkswagen company was producing far more engines than it built cars. And these engines, they were put in pumps, water pumps, as generators. They were used aircraft engines for light aircraft. It's amazing how many different functions that engine was put to. low compression, flat 4 boxer engine. So most people understand the basic origin story of the Volkswagen. It began really well, it has its origins going way back into the 1920s, when after the First World War a whole lot of the need for automobiles for military service meant there were a lot more people who knew how to drive, and there were a lot more vehicles on the road. And people in the motor industry realised that there's an opportunity here to mobilise people. The cars are very expensive to build and design and to run, and really it was not affordable for people working class. The best that they could hope to do was save up for a motorcycle. So a lot of designers tried to make a modern or an effective small car, but many companies just weren't interested because there was no money to be made in a cheap car. Money was in large, expensive, luxurious cars that the rich would buy and pay extravagant prices for all the extras that came with motoring. Ferdinand Porsche, he was born in Austria, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of course, which, interestingly enough, has a lot of really important vehicle pioneers. Joseph Gans, Paul Jarret, Hans Ledwinka from Tatra, Edmund Rumpler. All of these guys, they were they were really good engineers, and really practical engineers. Ferdinand Porsche was working at Daimler-Benz in the 1920s, and he'd been involved in their race division, building race cars, competition vehicles. And he had a pet project idea. He wanted to build a car for the everyday man. This idea brought him into conflict with the rest of the board, who saw no value in doing that whatsoever. And Ferdinand Porsche was a prickly fellow, and he's not the kind of person who would hold his tongue. So he ended up getting fired. From there he moved to Austro-Daimler, where he continued agitating. And eventually he got himself persona non grata there, and he eventually made his way to Steyr Puch, which is another Austrian car maker. And funnily enough, Hans Ledwinka of Tatra had formerly been their chief engineer during the early 1920s, and he had come into the same decisions or the same thought as Ferdinand Porsche, that we should focus on a budget car. He pitched that idea to the Steyr board, and they said no, not interested. So Ledwinka ended up resigning, and he moved back to Tatra, where they were very interested in his idea, and they developed that into what became the Tatra 11, which featured a number of important features. It had a central backbone chassis. It had independent swing action suspended wheels on all four wheels, and it had an air-cooled two-cylinder motor, and it was mounted at the front. That was a bit of a game-changing car. All the really innovative engineers of the period saw that car and thought, that's a really interesting idea. Joseph Gans, who's now somewhat dubiously claimed to be the originator of the Volkswagen idea, he borrowed that concept for a car he developed for Standard. He made one slight change to it though. He put the engine behind the front seat. It was only a very small car, it was a two-seater with a little bench behind it. And he put the engine just right behind the driver's seat. That car went on sale in 1934. More on that in a moment. So Porsche was in the same circles and working on his designs for a budget car. And he liked some of these ideas that Winker had developed, and he thought we could apply it better than he did. First time he actually got to put it into practice was a car project by the Zundap Motorcycle Company. I can't remember what the Porsche name was. Well, let's just call it the Zundap Porsche. It was originally a fairly boxy kind of prototype vehicle, had a central tube chassis, independent four-wheel suspension, and it had a engine mounted in the rear. They built 3 examples to test out the concept. They used 3 engines. One was a Zundap 5-cylinder radial engine. Very interesting concept. One was a 2-cylinder air-cooled 2-stroke motor, and the other was a 4-cylinder boxer motor that had been developed by Porsche. It was still very experimental. So they trialled this, and there was certain advantages, and it seemed like there was some merit in the design. But all this development was very, very expensive, of course, and there were a lot of problems with the car. And in weighing up the cost of the project versus the expected return on sales, Zundap decided we don't want to proceed. They stuck with motorcycles instead and remained a very, very important motorcycle manufacturer in Germany. NSU, which is another motorcycle company, they saw that project and they were interested in getting into that as well. And the funny thing about NSU at this time, and this is not really often reported very clearly in the literature of what you'll find online, NSU had a deal with Fiat prior to in the 1920s, and I think it expired in about 1932. Hence, this is why NSU was suddenly interested in developing their own car. Because prior to that, they had been building Fiat cars under license. So Fiat took over the project. NSU took over the project from Zundap, and Porsche was able to enhance the design and deal with some of the problems. There were certainly issues with the engine. It was now focused on the boxer engine. There were lots of problems with that engine. It was often had crankshaft and piston rod failures, all kinds of problems with that. Plus also the torsion bar suspension that Porsche was pushing was very weak, and the prototype cars had loads of catastrophic failure torsion bars. But it seemed to be pointing in the right direction. It's often said that only one vehicle was built, but that isn't true. There was at least two, and there were probably more, but only one car has survived, and that's now in the Volkswagen Museum in Wolfsburg. It's amazing that that survived, really, when you think about it. A prototype vehicle. It's very rare they manage to, go through decades of use and survive. So, 1933 comes along in Germany, and in the election of that year, the Nazis win. They win the majority, and Adolf Hitler is named as Chancellor. One of his first acts as Chancellor is to open the Berlin International Motor Show in early March, early 1933. I think it was March, I'm not entirely sure. So he opens the show and he makes a speech about the future of motoring in Germany. And he talks about the grand plans that the Nazis have, motorization, such as building a big national highway scheme across the country. He also talks about getting more people into cars and more motorization of the country. And to do that, they plan on reducing license fee costs, reducing road taxes, and making it cheaper for people to buy budget cars. That sparked a whole raft of things happening in the market. The major players like your Mercedes-Benz and your Opel, they don't want to see cheaper cars in the marketplace because they dominate. Same with a lot of other, the big players who build expensive cars. They do not want small car players in the market. But all of the small car players and motorcycle companies that are playing in that space as well, they all rush out and start developing their own budget car. And this is where Ganz's standard Superior appears. Now the standard Superior is in no way, it's completely independent development from Volkswagen, and really is nothing at all like Volkswagen. It shares some design features, but those features are incidental. The whole concept of the Standard was budget motoring of a very, very low standard. Ganz believed that an effective budget car needed to be 1,000 Reichsmarks at that time, because that was all a person on a normal salary could afford to spend when you added up fuel costs and maintenance costs and garaging and all licensing. The bottom end of the market could not afford to fork out more than $1,000 on a vehicle. Now, to get a vehicle down to $1,000, you have to strip out a whole lot of its features. The central tube chassis was popular in this market because it's simple. It's one single steel tube, torsionless tube, and you just have to put some bracing on it. It involves very little complex engineering, so that was why he chose that. Independent suspension, yep, you want decent road handling because you're going to need it in a car that has virtually no power. Air-cooled, or in this case it was water-cooled, two-cylinder, two-stroke motor of 500 cc's. Was placed in the rear over or just in front of the axle. Why rear engine? What was the purpose of that? Well, it's again all about cost and engineering. If you put the engine at the front of the car, you have to transmit the power through a tunnel to the rear wheels, or you drive the front wheel. If you're driving the front wheels like what DKW did, There is complex engineering in the axles to allow the wheels to turn. That's complicated, and everything that's complicated comes with a cost. Whereas, if you put the engine at the back directly over the rear wheels, it's simple. You just have a chain going to the rear wheels, like a motorcycle. Simplicity. Simplicity equals lower cost. Now, the first body that they put on the standard model, the first one that came out in 1934, was a fairly blocky and not very sophisticated looking plywood body, because that's what people in the budget market would do. You can knock together a fairly simple plywood body, put leatherette, which is kind of vinyl, artificial leather across the top of it, and that keeps the water out, at least for a while. Went on sale in 1934. It was displayed at the 1934 Berlin Auto Show. Now, of course, Adolf Hitler returns in 1934 to the next Berlin Auto Show to see the developments that have happened in the last 12 months. And he gets taken through, there's the Hall 1, which has got all the big players, the Mercedes-Benzes, the Auto Unions, we went to the Auto Union then, Horch, Wanderer, Opel, Ford, German Ford, Adler, all these major players. And then there's a second hall where all the trucks, tractors, motorcycles and budget cars are. So he's hustled down to the budget car section and said, here you see the German Volkswagens. All these cars varied in price from about 1,800 Reichsmarks down to the cheapest one was the Framo Piccolo at 1,400 Reichsmarks. And Hitler was horrified by what he saw. And I'll use the example of the Framo Piccolo because it was the cheapest car that was there on the market. It had been developed by Jürgen Rasmussen, who was the former owner of DKW. He'd been ousted in a coup at Auto Union and fired. But he still retained ownership of several of his companies that weren't in the Auto Union group, such as Framo. Framo built tricycle delivery carts and also sold fittings for motorcycles and cars to Auto Union. So he was still getting money out of the Auto Union conglomerate, but he'd been fired. He was very angry about it. So what he wanted to do was to out-budget DKW. Because in 1931, he trumped the market when he introduced the DKW F1 budget car, which was the first car that introduced front-wheel drive for a production vehicle. It was a huge winner. So he thought, if he can outprice the DKW F series, which was his own creation, he could seize that new market that was opening up for budget cars. So the Framo Piccolo looked like a shrunken down DKW. It had no radiator at the front, it just had a coal scuttle flat end. And it was powered by a DKW single cylinder 200cc stationary motor. So these were the kind of motors that you use to generate electricity, to operate a water pump, and all kinds of things, or operate an agricultural harvester. It was mounted in the back and drove the rear wheel by a chain. There was no instruments in the car at all. It just had a speedo, and it had only one door. So it was made of plywood as well. It was really basic. Hitler took one look at this and he made a speech afterwards to say that this is not what the German people want. The German people would expect a decent car. And when we say a decent car, we mean a real car made of steel, modern, using all the latest technologies, but built to a price that can be purchasable by the common man. So all of these little baby cars that were on show in 1934, almost all of them kind of went, they had a very, very short lifespan. The Standard was produced, Standard Superior was produced for about 2 or 3 years, maybe sold 300 or 400. The Framo Piccolo was the same kind of thing. It was really sold maybe 100 or 200 cars at the most. And all these other players, they all kind of dropped out of the market. In the meantime, well, the first thing that happened is that the major players who heard this, you know, we need to build a steel car, modern, with all modern features for a price of 1,000 Reichsmarks, they all lobbied up and went back to Hitler and said, it's impossible to do. It's impossible to do this. We cannot build a car. The best that we can do is something like the Opel. I've got the Opel P17 or something. I can't remember what it's called. But they had a small baby car which was just stripped down. They had shrunk everything. They had taken out everything that was seen as an extra, and they got it down to 1,600 Reichsmarks. And there was after a couple of years, they could bring it down to 1,500 Reichsmarks. And they were trying to convince Hitler just to say, that's it, that's as far and low as you could go. In the meantime, Ferdinand Porsche, this was like music to his ears. He'd been trying for ages to get these budget car projects up and running, but he needed more money to keep going and keep developing, because these cars took a lot of effort to design. So he wrote directly to Hitler the Volkswagen Manifesto, which he outlined in detail how the car would be built and all of its features, and he gave some sketches, designs, all the specs. Hitler was he didn't drive himself, but he was really interested in technology, and he would really read into technical specifications, and he had a real grasp of these things. Hitler met with Porsche and they discussed some of their shared vision, and it was approved. Approved to buy or to build 3 prototype cars for testing. So 3 cars got built at a Porsche's own development facility, which was I think in Zuffenhausen. I think it was in Austria, which is where the family home was. And they had a factory, well, it was not a factory, it was sort of a very large shed. They built one car which was built, embodied in plywood, and then they sent out a contract for the other 2 to 2 different bodybuilders who built them. And this is why you see some of these early photographs of the early Porsche prototypes, and the vehicles do not look alike at all. And that's because they were built by different people. The 3 cars were now, Porsche's concept was crystallizing. He was now convinced that the box engine was the right way to go. His engine engineer, I think, I can't remember his name properly, I think it was Remplis. He made modifications to the engine to reduce its compression and to detune it. So that, and also a very, very short stroke, which solved all the problems with broken crankshafts and broken connecting rods. It also made it the engine would just run forever, because it was really under very little stress at any time, which is interesting. And this is why, you know, cars like this, they just start, they just run. They will run even in the worst of conditions, and worst fuel, poor lubrication. They will just run because they are designed to run that way. Anyway, I'm coming home now, so I'll have to pick up this story later. Anyway, what happened was the 3 cars, they were tested. And they all had problems, of course. But the report that they gave back to the government was that there is something in this car. There are features about this car that warrant further investigation. And the government then authorized the production of 30 improved vehicles. That became the V35 model. These continued road testing, and I think those cars, they were really treated very roughly. They did like 1 million miles of road testing, and almost all of them failed at some point, which was the purpose of the testing, was to drive them till they failed and then find a way of ensuring that didn't happen again. It took a lot longer. I mean, Hitler was not the happiest, he was certainly not the most patient of men. And this plan that he'd announced in like 1933, we were getting to 1936, 37 by this time, he was very, very frustrated with it. But at the end of the day, I think in 1937, they finally had a vehicle that was ready to go into production, and that then became the Volkswagen Beetle. So that's a bit of a roundabouty kind of waffly version of the history of Volkswagen Beetle. I'll talk a bit more about that in another drive. And I also still have to talk about how the beautiful Karmann Ghia was developed, because that is a story in itself. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this, and look forward to seeing you on the next drive. Thank you.